You know, I suppose it's time we actually painted some SPSF Kodachrome on this channel, given what the name of my channel is. That's right, today we will not be painting so fast and we will be weathering up this Athearn SD40R in the Southern Pacific version of SPSF Kodachrome. So this is kind of the standard Athearn line of locomotives. This is not their Genesis series. I'll pull up the box here real quick so you can see. This is kind of, I guess, their new version of the blue box models back in the day. So it's not a Genesis. It's a little cheaper. I got this from the homies at Lombard Hobbies for I think 180 bucks. Pretty good price. As a result, it is not perfect. It's not the best quality model in the world, but it also doesn't need to be. You know, my opinion personally is not every single piece of equipment in my fleet needs to be a museum quality, you know, brass level heirloom model. You know, like you can see off the bat. Let me, oops, not that far. Let me zoom in and get the camera centered here. Like, okay, you can see these exhaust frames. These are molded in. These aren't like photo etch that were separately applied. Some of the detail on the hood doors isn't the greatest. There, you know, there's a little bit of a gap running along the bottom by the battery boxes and such. But it's a cheaper model, and you know, for the purposes of just building up your locomotive fleet and expanding your collection, you know, like I said, I'm not too upset about it for the price. A couple things of note that I did want to mention that I know are wrong with this particular model. I know at various points in their lives, these locomotives had various different configurations of air brake cylinders. I'm not enough of an expert to know exactly when they had which air brake cylinders mounted where. I know for a while, they had them mounted on the inside of the truck frames and then they moved them outside. There's pictures of them everywhere. Given that I'm modeling this in a kind of fantasy setting where the merger went through, I'm not too worried about it, but if you are trying to like model a specific year or a specific date, something to be aware of. The model I got, the horn was bent, and you can see it's still a little bit bent. I'm going to have to keep slowly bending it back. I'm not necessarily going to hold Athearn accountable for that, because, you know, that could have easily happened during shipping or whatever. Apart from saying that, you know, maybe they could design a little bit better of a shell to hold it. The big thing that jumped out at me right away is on the gyro light on the nose. Let me zoom in all the way here so we can see this. The gyro light on the nose, the actual bulb sticks way out of the light housing. Now, it's worthy of mention that on these real gyro lights, they did have sort of a dome-shaped lens on the front, but it didn't stick out quite this far. And like I said, that appears to be the actual bulb that's sticking out there. Not the end of the world. It just looked kind of odd the first time I saw that sticking out like that. It kind of reminds me of like when micro LEDs first came out, like if you remember the old Atlas or the old Proto 2000 locomotives, how they just stick the bulb right through the housing and it would stick out a little bit. But again, it's a cheaper model, that's to be expected, and given how often these emergency lights were actually used, and I expect to have it lit up very rarely, you know, it doesn't bother me too much. It also came with a couple little baggies of parts. This one has additional drop steps you can put down if you want to have the drop step lowered, as well as a horn with the bells in different configuration, as well as blinking plates if you wanted to remove the SP lighting package for some reason. It also came with some sprues, with just some additional black plastic parts to mount on the fuel tank and the underframe. Again, being that this is a little cheaper of a model, that's to be expected. And it is really cool that they still included it. And they included on the instructions where to put them, which is always helpful. So before we get started weathering, I'm going to go ahead and try and pop the fuel tank off and get those extra details mounted to it. And then we will go from there. Alrighty, that was pretty straightforward. The fuel tank is actually just held on with one screw, and then it just slides off, and then you can easily add the parts to both ends. Going to start by painting some details on the top of the locomotive. I'm going to start off doing the exhaust stack using my usual mixture of a light rust color and a brown color. In this case, this is Mission Models NATO Brown and Mission Models Standard Rust, just one drop of each. I don't know why my camera is wigging out like that. I apologize. Not trying to be perfect here. Most of this will be covered up when I do the exhaust stains on the roof. And the paint would wear off unevenly in real life. Just trying to make a nice base coat for the soot to sit on top of. And while I've got this color mixed up, I'm just going to go ahead and do some rust splotches on the front coupler and the front pilot. Interestingly, while Southern Pacific let their locomotives get pretty dirty, from the reference photos I've seen, these guys didn't get especially rusty. Which is odd. You just see a little bit, you know, the paint chipping off right around the snowplow. You know, on these chains up here. That's to be expected. Yeah, she's going to be a dirty girl when we're done, but not a rusty one. One little detail that I found interesting while I was looking through reference photos was also that apparently some of these guys, even in Kodachrome paint, had their horns either replaced or repainted at some point, with horns painted in just the standard SP Battleship gray color. And while I don't think this locomotive specifically was one of them in the real world, in my weird made-up setting, I'm going to make it one of those that received a gray horn. This is just Vallejo gray. So for step 2, we're going to go a little bit out of order compared to what I usually do. We're going to start by doing, I guess, kind of a weathering base coat with oil paints. Particularly this nice black color from Abteilung 502. Jawohl, Herr Kaloi. But what this is going to do is Southern Pacific is known for letting their locomotives get pretty dirty, especially on the parts of their network that had a lot of tunnels. Think Tehachapi Pass, Donner Pass, and Pengra Pass, which is where I plan on modeling. So their locomotives would just get caked in soot, especially on the top part, you know, obviously around the exhaust stacks and the radiator fans, but also on the tops of the cab, the top of the nose, and even alongside by the radiator grills, dynamic brakes. You get the picture. So by starting by doing a black oil paint wash, this is going to determine kind of how much airbrushing I have to do, right? I know I want a lot of the top of the locomotive to be covered in soot and grime, but oil paints is going to allow me to have some control over exactly how much. Of note, you can see in some of the reference photos, and if I remember I will put them up now, for some reason this area right above the number boards, and the whole top of the cab obviously, but this area above the number boards and the front door just seemed to get really heavily coated with black soot for some reason. And it's noticeable compared to the rest of the locomotive, right? And then when it would rain, this soot would get mixed with water and it would kind of turn into this black paste that would just cover the top of the locomotive. And again, you can see this on even locomotives that are kind of in service now, you know, or even like a heavy diesel truck or something, right? So we're just going to be painting this on for now, using Old Reliable. And yes, it's intentional that I'm using an old shitty brush for this. Again, when it comes to weathering, randomness is your friend, and having an old shitty brush like this that has bristles going off in whatever direction, I find can add to that layer of randomness. Because you don't necessarily want to control exactly where all your wash is going in this case. And if it does end up going somewhere you don't want because this is an oil paint, it takes days to dry, you have plenty of time to wipe it off. So once again, we're going to be painting some black over black. And you might think that that's silly. The cool part about Tylone 502 kind of oil paint system is the matte effect thinner actually does have a really nice matte effect. So even though it's not going to change the color of the top of the locomotive, it is going to change the texture pretty significantly. It's going to kill off the sort of satin sheen that these locomotives come with and make it look like it's covered in soot and dirt. Even if it's not readily apparent at first, there will be a difference in sheen on the top of the locomotive. Went ahead and added, not really a drop I guess, but a chunk of burnt sienna to my mix, as well as a little bit of more matte thinner. And I'm just going to sort of use that as a pin wash over the trucks and the pilots and the fuel tanks to simulate road dust and also some accumulated surface rust. So you can see, just letting the paints kind of just sit on the model for about 5 minutes. You can see how it's naturally kind of flowed and collected in areas like on the real locomotives where the soot and the dirt would accumulate. I'm now going to go over like the side, the engine compartment doors and everything, and just wipe off the excess that has accumulated on the top. Again, much like a pin wash, just let the oil paint work its way down in between the doors and the panel lines on the side of the locomotive. Alright, so, had a little bit of an interesting development occur. I actually broke my airbrush. Well, I don't know if I necessarily broke it, but it broke. I was trying to clean it, and the threaded part of the nozzle sheared off inside the housing of the airbrush itself. And like, I don't have an easy out or anything that small to try to get it out, so I guess I'm gonna send it back to Grex and see if maybe they can fix it. If not, maybe they'll send me a new one, because that should be under warranty, because that's bullshit. Regardless, thankfully, I happen to have a spare. See, we're not hoarders in this hobby, we're just prepared. This is an Iwata Neo. I am fully aware this is not the best airbrush to be using for miniature work. I got this years and years ago, I think when I was in college, because I was using a shitty Pache single action airbrush and I just really wanted a double action airbrush, and this was like the cheapest one I could find. This is more for doing like cars and stuff like that. You shouldn't get one of these if you're going to be doing models. But I made it work for over a decade, and we can make it work now, especially for just doing some weathering on our locomotive. Particularly, we're going to be using it for the exhaust. In hindsight, it's kind of good that I started off by doing the oil paint wash on the top of the locomotive. Because that will mean that our airbrushing is a little less critical. So again, I'm using Vallejo Model Air, gray blue for my exhaust. I go into a full explanation why I do that if you go back to part 1 of the series. Yeah, and as you can see, this is not the best spray pattern coming out of this brush. For weathering, that's not such a critical thing because we want it to be a little random looking. But obviously if I were trying to do any actual model painting with this, this would not be the ideal brush to use. Alrighty, so now our washes have dried. There's some areas, particularly where I used the enamels on the model, that ended up drying kind of shiny, so I'm going to just go ahead and unify the finish with just a rattle can satin coat because my airbrush is out of commission. Won't be doing anything fancy, and then we should be able to call this one done. And there we are. I'm calling it there. Like I said, not the most complex weathering job I've ever done, not the most detailed model I own, but I also don't think it needs to be. You know, it's good to have a couple of these locomotives that maybe aren't the centerpiece of the display, you know, to sit in the background at the engine shop, or if you need like a mid-train helper or something. It serves a purpose, like I said. And considering, again, that my airbrush broke in the middle of weathering it, I think it turned out pretty good. Still waiting to hear back from Grex what they're gonna do, if they're gonna give me a new one or if they can salvage it. So we'll keep you updated on that. In the meantime, I'm going to try to find another project that I can do that doesn't require an airbrush while I get mine fixed. And yeah, we'll see what madness I come up with next. Appreciate y'all watching.